The morning Sarah Martinez stepped onto Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, she had no idea that within 48 hours, she would become the most talked about person on the entire installation. What started as routine questioning about her presence in restricted areas would spiral into a base-wide investigation, heated confrontations, and ultimately a revelation that would leave hardened Marines speechless and scrambling to salute. Sometimes the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about people who don't fit the mold we expect. And sometimes those assumptions can cost you your career, your reputation, and your respect. This is the story of how one woman's quiet confidence in the face of hostility would expose the deep-seated biases within one of America's most elite fighting forces, and how her true identity would turn everything upside down in ways no one saw coming. What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted, and the person you're targeting turns out to be the one person you should never, ever cross. The California sun was just beginning to pierce through the morning fog when Sarah Martinez pulled her rental car up to the main gate of Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. At 28 years old, she had the kind of understated presence that could easily blend into a crowd, which had served her well throughout her career. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes that were neat but unremarkable. To anyone watching, she looked like just another contractor or civilian employee reporting for work. The security guard at the gate barely glanced at her identification before waving her through. Sarah had been through this routine dozens of times at military installations across the country, but something felt different about this place. Maybe it was the way the Marines moved with that particular swagger that came from knowing they were part of something elite, or maybe it was the tension she could sense beneath the surface of their professional demeanor. Sarah had been called to Camp Pendleton on what her superiors had described as a routine assessment. Her official cover story was that she was a civilian contractor conducting efficiency reviews of base operations. It was a role she had played before, and one that typically allowed her to move freely around military installations without drawing too much attention. What the Marines didn't know was that Sarah's real job was far more sensitive, and her true credentials would have commanded immediate respect and cooperation from every person on the base. As she drove through the sprawling installation, Sarah took mental notes of everything she observed. The base was impressive in its scope and organization. Marines moved with purpose between buildings, their uniforms crisp and their bearing unmistakably military. She could see training exercises taking place in the distance, with Marines running in formation and the sound of weapons fire echoing from the ranges. This was a place where America's finest came to hone their skills and prepare for combat. Sarah's first stop was the administrative building where she was supposed to check in with the base commanding officer. She had arranged this meeting weeks in advance, but when she arrived at the reception desk, the young Marine corporal behind the desk looked confused when she presented her credentials. "Ma'am, I don't have you on the schedule for today," the corporal said, scanning his computer screen with growing uncertainty. "Are you sure you're supposed to be meeting with the colonel today?" Sarah maintained her calm exterior, though internally she felt a familiar flutter of concern. Mixed-up appointments were not uncommon in her line of work, but they always created complications. "I have a confirmed appointment for 0900 hours, she said, showing him the paperwork she had received from her handlers. "Perhaps you could check with the colonel's aide?" The corporal made a phone call, speaking in hushed tones while glancing at Sarah with obvious skepticism. After a few minutes, he hung up and shook his head. "Ma'am, the colonel's aide says there's no record of any appointment with a civilian contractor today. He's asking who authorized your access to the base." This was where things started to go wrong. Sarah knew that her cover had been established through proper channels, but military bureaucracy was notorious for its complexity and potential for error. Someone, somewhere, had failed to properly coordinate her visit, and now she found herself in the awkward position of being on a military base without clear authorization. "There must be some mistake," Sarah said calmly. "I have all the proper documentation. Perhaps I could speak directly with someone in the colonel's office." The corporal looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to wait here while I contact the military police. We need to verify your authorization to be on this base." Sarah nodded and took a seat in the waiting area, but she could feel the situation spiraling out of control. Within minutes, 2 military police officers arrived, their expressions serious and professional. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez was a compact man with intense dark eyes and the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. His partner, Sergeant Lisa Chun, was tall and athletic with the sharp gaze of someone who missed very little. "Ma'am, I'm Staff Sergeant Rodriguez with the military police," Rodriguez said as he approached Sarah. "We understand there's some confusion about your authorization to be on this base. We're going to need to see all of your identification and documentation." Sarah complied without protest, handing over her driver's license, contractor identification, and the paperwork related to her supposed consulting assignment. She watched as the 2 MPs examined her documents with the thoroughness of seasoned investigators. She could see them exchanging glances, and she knew they were finding inconsistencies. "Ma'am, this paperwork shows you're supposed to be conducting efficiency reviews, but we don't have any record of this project being authorized," Sergeant Chin said. "The contact information on your paperwork doesn't match any department we can find, and frankly, some of these signatures look irregular." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Her cover identity had been compromised, either through bureaucratic error or something more serious. She couldn't reveal her true credentials without authorization from her superiors, but she also couldn't allow herself to be detained or removed from the base before completing her mission. "Officers, I understand your concerns," Sarah said carefully. "Perhaps if you could contact my supervisor, we can clear this up quickly." She provided them with a phone number that would connect them to a carefully maintained cover office, but she knew that even that contact would only be able to confirm her contractor story, not her real identity. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped away to make the phone call, while Sergeant Chun kept a watchful eye on Sarah. The few minutes that followed felt like hours as Sarah waited to see how her handlers would respond to this unexpected complication. When Rodriguez returned, his expression was even more serious than before. "Ma'am, the number you provided goes to a consulting firm that claims they've never heard of you," Rodriguez said. "They have no record of anyone by your name working for them, and they deny having any contracts with the Marine Corps." Sarah felt her heart sink. Her cover was completely blown, and she was now in a very dangerous position. She was on a secure military installation with false credentials and no way to prove her legitimate reason for being there. The Marines had every right to detain her and treat her as a potential security threat. "Ma'am, you're going to need to come with us for further questioning," Sergeant Chin said, her hand moving instinctively to her handcuffs. "We have reason to believe you may have gained unauthorized access to this installation under false pretenses." As Sarah stood up to accompany the military police, she noticed that word of the situation was already spreading. Marines throughout the administrative building were watching with obvious curiosity and suspicion. She could hear whispered conversations and see pointing fingers. Within minutes, she had gone from being an unremarkable civilian contractor to being the subject of intense scrutiny and suspicion. The MPs escorted Sarah to their patrol vehicle, and as they drove through the base toward the military police station, she could see Marines stopping their activities to watch them pass. News traveled fast on military installations, and she knew that by the end of the day, every Marine on the base would have heard about the mysterious woman who had tried to infiltrate their installation with fake credentials. At the military police station, Sarah was placed in an interview room that was stark and intimidating. The walls were bare except for official portraits of the president and the commandant of the Marine Corps. A metal table and chairs were the only furniture, and a single fluorescent light cast harsh shadows around the room. She had been in similar rooms before, but always on the other side of the investigation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and Sergeant Shund took turns questioning her, their approach professional, but increasingly aggressive as they failed to get satisfactory answers to their questions. Sarah maintained her cover story as long as she could, but it was becoming clear that her fictional identity was falling apart under scrutiny. "Look, ma'am, we've run your fingerprints, and they're not in any civilian database," Rodriguez said, leaning back in his chair. "Your social security number checks out, but everything else about your story is starting to look very suspicious. Who are you really? And what are you doing on this base?" Sarah knew she was running out of options. She couldn't maintain her cover much longer, and she couldn't reveal her true identity without proper authorization. She was trapped between two impossible choices, and she could see that the Marines were losing patience with her evasive answers. "I understand your position, Staff Sergeant," Sarah said finally. "But I need to make a phone call to my superiors before I can provide you with any additional information." Rodriguez and Chin exchanged another look. "Ma'am, you're not under arrest at this time, but you are being detained for questioning regarding a potential security breach. You have the right to make one phone call, but it's going to be monitored, and if we don't get some straight answers soon, we're going to have to escalate this situation." As Sarah was led to a phone in the military police station, she knew that her next call would determine not just the success of her mission, but potentially her freedom and her career. The Marines at Camp Pendleton thought they had caught an infiltrator, but they had no idea that they were about to discover they had been investigating someone whose true authority far exceeded their own. The tension in the military police station was palpable as Sarah dialed a number that would connect her to people with the power to turn this entire situation upside down. As she waited for someone to answer, she could see the MPs watching her every move, confident that they had caught a spy or saboteur in the act. They had no idea how wrong they were and how dramatically their world was about to change. Sarah's phone call lasted exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez timed it, partly out of professional habit, and partly because something about the woman's calm demeanor during what should have been a terrifying situation was making him increasingly uneasy. Most people caught with false credentials on a military base would be panicked, angry, or at least visibly stressed. Sarah Martinez sat in that chair like she was waiting for a routine dental appointment. When she hung up the phone, she simply said, "Someone will be in touch within the hour to clarify the situation." Rodriguez felt his jaw tighten. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we've heard that story before. We're going to need something more concrete than mysterious phone calls to unnamed supervisors." What Rodriguez didn't know was that Sarah's call had gone directly to a secure line at the Pentagon, where a very specific protocol had been activated. Within minutes of her call, encrypted messages were being sent to military commanders across multiple branches of service. Her situation had been classified as a Code 7 incident, which meant that standard military police procedures were about to be suspended in favor of something much more serious. While Sarah waited in the interview room, word of her detention had spread throughout Camp Pendleton like wildfire. Marines had a talent for gossip that rivaled any small town, and the story of the mysterious woman with fake credentials was being embellished with each retelling. By noon, some Marines were convinced she was a foreign spy, while others speculated she might be a terrorist conducting surveillance for a future attack. Colonel James Harrison, the base commanding officer, had been in meetings all morning and was just learning about the situation when his aide burst into his office with obvious urgency. "Sir, we may have a problem," Captain Rebecca Walsh said, slightly out of breath from rushing across the base. "The MPs have detained a civilian who tried to gain access to the base with fraudulent credentials. They've been questioning her for several hours, but she's not talking, and her story doesn't check out at all." Colonel Harrison looked up from his paperwork with mild irritation. "Captain, we get people with expired or incorrect credentials every week. Why is this one special?" "Sir, there's something different about this one. She's too calm, too prepared. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez thinks she might be conducting surveillance. And honestly, sir, her behavior is consistent with someone who has professional training." The colonel's expression grew more serious. In the current global security environment, the possibility of foreign intelligence operatives targeting Marine installations was a constant concern. "What do we know about her?" "Not much, sir. She claims to be a contractor named Sarah Martinez, but her cover story is falling apart under investigation. Her supposed employer has never heard of her, and some of her documentation appears to be fabricated. Colonel Harrison stood up and walked to his window, which overlooked the sprawling base where thousands of Marines were going about their daily training and duties. The idea that a potential spy had penetrated his installation was deeply troubling, but something about the situation didn't feel right to him. "Has she asked for a lawyer?" he asked. "No, sir. That's part of what's strange about this. She made one phone call and then just sat back and waited. Most people in her situation would be demanding lawyers, making threats, or at least showing some sign of stress." The colonel made a decision that would prove to be prescient. "I want a full security investigation initiated immediately. Contact the FBI and have them send a team to take over the interrogation. If we're dealing with professional espionage, we need people with the right expertise." Meanwhile, in the military police station, Sarah was becoming increasingly aware that her situation was escalating beyond the control of the local MPs. She could hear phones ringing constantly, and she noticed a steady stream of higher-ranking Marines arriving at the station. What had started as a simple credentials mix-up was turning into a major security incident. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez returned to the interview room with Sergeant Chun and a Marine Sarah hadn't seen before. The new arrival was a tall, imposing man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Ma'am, I'm Major Thompson from Intelligence," the newcomer said as he took a seat across from Sarah. "I understand you've been having some difficulty explaining your presence on this base." Sarah recognized the shift in tactics immediately. They were bringing in interrogators with more sophisticated training, which meant they were taking her potential threat very seriously. She maintained her calm exterior while calculating how much longer she would need to wait for her situation to be resolved. "Major, I've been as cooperative as possible under the circumstances," Sarah replied. "I'm waiting for my superiors to provide the clarification that will resolve this misunderstanding." Major Thompson opened a file folder and spread several documents across the table. "Ms. Martinez, if that's really your name, we've been doing some additional research into your background. Your social security number belongs to a Sarah Martinez, but that woman died in a car accident 3 years ago in Denver, Colorado." Sarah felt a cold stab of alarm. Her handlers had assured her that her cover identity was solid, but apparently there were flaws in the documentation that were now being exposed under thorough investigation. The situation was becoming more dangerous by the minute. "Furthermore," Major Thompson continued, "we've discovered that the address listed on your driver's license corresponds to a vacant lot in Phoenix. Your supposed employer doesn't exist, and the bank account associated with your credit cards was opened just 2 weeks ago with a cash deposit." The walls were closing in, and Sarah knew that within a few hours, the Marines would have enough evidence to charge her with serious federal crimes related to identity theft and potential espionage. She needed her handlers to intervene immediately, or her mission would become the least of her problems. "Major, I understand how this looks," Sarah said carefully, "but I urge you to be patient for just a little longer. There are people with appropriate authority who can explain this situation." Major Thompson leaned back in his chair and studied Sarah with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Ma'am, in my experience, when someone uses a dead person's identity to gain access to a military installation, patience is not the appropriate response. We're looking at potential charges of identity theft, fraudulent entry onto a federal installation, and possibly espionage." The word espionage hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Sarah knew that if she were charged with spying against the United States, she could face decades in prison or even the death penalty, depending on what evidence the Marines thought they had gathered. At that moment, there was a sharp knock on the interview room door. Sergeant Chun stepped outside for a brief conversation, then returned with a puzzled expression on her face. "Sir, there's a phone call for you," Chun said to Major Thompson. "It's from someone at the Pentagon who says it's regarding this case." Major Thompson excused himself, leaving Sarah alone with the 2 military police officers. She could see Rodriguez and Chun whispering to each other, probably speculating about what kind of high-level attention their case was suddenly receiving. When Major Thompson returned 15 minutes later, his entire demeanor had changed. The confident interrogator had been replaced by someone who looked confused and slightly apprehensive. "Ms. Martinez," he said slowly, "it appears that your case is being transferred to a different authority. We've been instructed to suspend our investigation pending the arrival of federal personnel who will be taking over your situation." Sarah allowed herself the smallest hint of relief, but she knew she wasn't out of danger yet. Her handlers were clearly intervening, but the damage to her cover was extensive, and it remained to be seen how they would extract her from this situation without compromising her real identity. "When will these federal personnel be arriving?" Rodriguez asked Major Thompson. "They're already en route," Thompson replied. "We're to maintain Ms. Martinez in custody until they arrive, but we're not to continue any interrogation." The next few hours passed in tense silence. Sarah was moved to a holding cell that was more comfortable than the interview room, but no less confining. She could hear increased activity throughout the military police station, with personnel coming and going at all hours, and phone calls being made and received constantly. As evening approached, Sarah became aware of unusual activity outside the military police station. Through the small window in her cell, she could see black SUVs arriving, along with personnel in dark suits who moved with the purposeful efficiency of federal agents. Her extraction was beginning, but she knew that the most dangerous part of her situation was just beginning. The Marines at Camp Pendleton thought they had caught a spy, and they had assembled impressive evidence to support their theory. What they didn't know was that the woman they had been investigating for the past 12 hours was about to be revealed as someone whose true credentials would make their accusations seem not just wrong, but potentially career-ending. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside her cell told Sarah that her long wait was almost over. Soon, the Marines who had spent the day building a case against her would discover just how catastrophically they had misjudged the situation. The real story was about to begin. The delegation that arrived at Camp Pendleton that evening was unlike anything the Marines had ever seen. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the military police station at exactly 1900 hours, followed by a 4th vehicle that bore the distinctive markings of a high-ranking military staff car. The personnel who emerged were a mixture of federal agents and military officers whose uniforms displayed ribbons and insignia that commanded immediate respect. Leading the group was a woman in her 50s wearing the uniform of a Navy admiral, her silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and her bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Behind her walked a man in civilian clothes whose identification badge marked him as Deputy Director of a federal agency whose full name was classified. The remaining members of the group moved with the coordinated precision of a special operations unit. Colonel Harrison had been summoned from his quarters to meet the delegation personally, and as he approached the group in the parking lot of the military police station, he felt a growing sense that he was about to be involved in something far beyond his normal scope of authority. "Colonel Harrison," the admiral said as she approached, returning his salute with crisp military precision. "I'm Admiral Patricia Kane, Director of Naval Intelligence. We need to discuss the situation regarding the individual you have in custody." Colonel Harrison felt his throat go dry. Naval intelligence directors did not travel to Marine bases at night to discuss routine security incidents. Whatever was happening with Sarah Martinez was clearly much more significant than anyone at Camp Pendleton had realized. "Admiral, we've been cooperating fully with federal authorities regarding Ms. Martinez," Colonel Harrison said carefully. "My personnel have documented everything according to standard procedures." Admiral Kane's expression was unreadable. "Colonel, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. The individual you know as Sarah Martinez is actually Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Elena Vasquez, United States Marine Corps, currently assigned to a joint task force that operates under direct Pentagon authority." The words hit Colonel Harrison like a physical blow. He felt his knees go weak as the implications of what Admiral Kane had just told him began to sink in. His Marines had been investigating detaining, and essentially accusing one of their own officers of espionage. "Admiral, that's impossible," Colonel Harrison managed to say. "We verified her credentials. Her identity documents were fraudulent. Her cover story didn't check out." "Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez has been operating under deep cover for a classified mission that required a completely fabricated civilian identity," the deputy director said, speaking for the first time. "Her false credentials were created by the same people who create identities for undercover federal agents. The fact that your people were able to detect flaws in her cover actually speaks well of their investigative abilities." Inside the military police station, Sarah could hear the commotion as the federal team arrived. She had been moved back to the interview room, and through the small window, she could see Marines and federal agents conferring in hushed tones. She knew that within minutes, her true identity would be revealed, and the Marines who had spent the day treating her as a potential enemy would discover that she outranked most of them. Major Thompson appeared in the doorway of the interview room, his face pale and his hands visibly shaking. Behind him stood Admiral Kane, whose presence filled the small room with an almost electric sense of authority. "Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez," Admiral Kane said formally, "I apologize for the delay in resolving this situation. Are you injured or in need of medical attention?" Sarah stood and came to attention, her posture instantly transforming from that of a detained civilian to that of a seasoned Marine officer. "No," admitted. "I am unharmed and ready to continue my mission." Major Thompson looked like he was going to be sick. In the space of 30 seconds, he had gone from interrogating a suspected spy to standing in the presence of a lieutenant colonel whose actual military credentials far exceeded his own. The woman he had been threatening with espionage charges was not only a Marine, but a senior officer whose security clearance and operational authority dwarfed anything he had ever encountered. "Major Thompson," Admiral Kane said, turning her attention to the increasingly uncomfortable intelligence officer. "Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez is currently assigned to a joint counterintelligence operation that involves the highest levels of national security. Her presence on this base was not only authorized, it was specifically requested by the Pentagon." The revelation sent shockwaves throughout the military police station as word spread among the Marines who had been involved in the investigation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been so confident in his interrogation techniques, found himself facing the reality that he had been treating a superior officer as a criminal suspect for the better part of a day. Colonel Harrison arrived at the military police station and was escorted directly to the interview room where Sarah was now meeting with Admiral Kane and the federal team. When he saw her in person for the first time, he was struck by how different she looked now that her true identity had been revealed. The calm confidence he had heard about from his staff now made perfect sense. She hadn't been afraid because she had known that her real credentials would eventually surface and vindicate her. "Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez," Colonel Harrison said as he entered the room, "on behalf of my entire command, I apologize for the treatment you received today. Had we known your true identity..." Sarah raised her hand to stop him. "Colonel, your Marines performed exactly as they should have. They encountered someone with suspicious credentials and questionable authorization, and they responded appropriately. If anything, this incident demonstrates that your base security protocols are working effectively." But even as Sarah spoke diplomatically, everyone in the room understood that the situation had serious implications for the Marines who had been involved in her detention and interrogation. Military careers had been destroyed for lesser mistakes, and the fact that they had essentially accused a decorated officer of treason was not something that would be easily forgotten or forgiven. Admiral Kane seemed to read the thoughts of everyone in the room. "Colonel Harrison, Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez's mission requires that her cover identity remain intact. For operational security reasons, the details of what happened here today must be classified at the highest levels. Your personnel will need to be debriefed and sworn to secrecy regarding this entire incident. Over the next several hours, every Marine who had been involved in Sarah's detention was brought in for individual meetings with federal security officers. They were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, and were briefed on the severe legal consequences they would face if they ever discussed the incident with anyone who did not have appropriate security clearances. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found himself in the surreal position of being debriefed about his interrogation of a lieutenant colonel. The federal agents were professional, but firm in making it clear that his career would be over if he ever breathed a word about what had happened. Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the agents, said during his debriefing, "You need to understand that Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez is involved in operations that are vital to national security. The fact that you were able to detect flaws in her cover identity actually demonstrates excellent police work on your part, but the mission she's involved in cannot be compromised by any disclosure of her real identity." As dawn broke over Camp Pendleton, the extraordinary night was coming to an end. The federal team was preparing to depart, taking Sarah with them to continue whatever classified mission had brought her to the base in the first place. But before she left, she made a point of personally thanking each of the Marines who had been involved in her investigation. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said as she found him preparing for his morning shift, "I want you to know that your investigation was thorough and professional. In a different situation, the techniques you used might have uncovered a real security threat. Don't let this incident make you second-guess your instincts." Rodriguez was still struggling to process everything that had happened. Colonel, I'm sorry for the way I treated you yesterday. I had no idea." "Sergeant, you treated me exactly as you would treat any suspected security threat. And that's exactly what you should have done," Sarah replied. "The fact that my cover was so thoroughly dismantled actually tells me that this base has excellent security procedures." As Sarah prepared to leave Camp Pendleton, Colonel Harrison walked her to the vehicle that would take her away from the base, where she had spent the most unusual 24 hours of her military career. "Colonel Vasquez," he said, "I have to ask, what was your actual mission here? What were you really supposed to be doing?" Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving at the base. "Colonel, I was conducting exactly the kind of assessment I claimed to be doing. The difference is that instead of evaluating administrative efficiency, I was evaluating security protocols and the base's ability to detect and respond to potential infiltration attempts." Colonel Harrison felt his jaw drop. "You mean this entire incident was a test?" "Not exactly a test, Colonel, but let's just say that your Marines' response to my presence here will be included in a report that goes directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And based on what I observed, that report will be very favorable to Camp Pendleton." As Sarah's vehicle disappeared through the main gate of Camp Pendleton, the Marines she left behind were still trying to process what had happened to them. They had started the day thinking they were dealing with a routine security incident and ended up discovering that they had been part of a classified operation whose true purpose they might never fully understand. The story of the mysterious woman with fake credentials became one of those legendary tales that Marines would tell for years to come, though always in whispers and only to people with appropriate security clearances. Most of the details would remain classified indefinitely, but the lesson was clear. In the world of military intelligence and national security, nothing was ever exactly what it seemed. For Sarah Martinez, or Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Elena Vasquez, the incident at Camp Pendleton would be just one chapter in a career filled with classified missions and assumed identities. But for the Marines who had been involved in her investigation, it would serve as a permanent reminder that in their line of work, the most dangerous assumptions were often the ones they made about people who didn't fit the expected mold. The morning after Sarah's departure, Camp Pendleton returned to its normal routine of training and operations, but the Marines who had been involved in the previous day's events moved through their duties with a new understanding of how complex and unpredictable their world really was. They had learned that sometimes the person you're investigating turns out to be the one person you should never, ever cross, and that in the shadowy world of military intelligence, the truth is often far more extraordinary than any fiction anyone could imagine.